Chapter 1. The Art of Vanishing. The pre-dawn chill seeped through the thin soles of Aria's worn boots as she navigated the limestone corridors of the Alpha's estate. Every step was a calculated silence, a rhythmic dance she had perfected over 5 grueling years of servitude. While the rest of the Silver Moon Pack slumbered in the warmth of their feathered beds, she carried the weight of their excess in a heavy galvanized bucket. The scent of expensive pine floor wax and stale ale from the previous night's revelry clung to the damp air, thick enough to choke a lesser wolf. Aria simply tightened her grip on the iron handle, her knuckles turning a ghostly white against the metal. To the warriors who would soon patrol these halls, she was nothing more than a ghost in a tattered tunic, a piece of living furniture that cleaned their messes and absorbed their casual cruelty without a sound. Her internal world remained a fortress of steel and shadow, far removed from the mundane task of scrubbing bloodstains off the foyer tiles. Every muscle in her body hummed with a suppressed frequency, a remnant of a life stolen before it could truly begin. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace that she carefully masked under a deliberate, clumsy slouch whenever eyes were upon her. Why did they never look closer at the girl who never spoke? The question often drifted through her mind like smoke, but the answer was always the same. People only see what they expect to find. They expected a broken omega, a discarded remnant of a fallen lineage, so that was the mask she wore with agonizing precision. As she reached the grand staircase, a sudden vibration in the floorboards signaled the approach of the morning watch. Aria didn't panic. She simply melted into the alcove behind a towering marble bust of the first Alpha. 2 high-ranking enforcers strode past, their heavy leather boots echoing like thunderclaps in the narrow passage. Their conversation was sharp, hushed, and laced with a frantic energy that made the hair on Aria's neck stand upright. They spoke of the upcoming Alpha Council, a gathering of the 5 great packs that hadn't occurred in nearly a decade. One warrior mentioned a breach in the northern perimeter, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper as he spoke of a traitor within their own ranks. Aria's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, not from fear of discovery, but from the sudden, sharp scent of opportunity. Her father's face, a blurred memory of warmth and silver fur, flashed across her mind with a pang of ancient grief. He had been accused of the very crime these men now discussed, a lie that had ended in fire and the smell of burning cedar. She had survived by becoming a shadow, but shadows are the best tools for unearthing secrets buried in the dark. The enforcers' voices faded as they rounded the corner toward the training grounds, leaving Aria alone with the ringing silence of the hallway. She realized then that the board was shifting, and her long-awaited moment of reckoning was finally beginning to take shape. Would she have the strength to step out of the darkness when the time came? Or had the light become her greatest enemy? Moving with renewed urgency, she finished her rounds and slipped toward the back service entrance of the library. This was her sanctuary, the only place where the ghosts of the past felt tangible enough to touch. The air here was dry and smelled of ancient parchment and vanilla, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the pack house. She knew the secret latch on the 3rd shelf, a mechanism hidden behind a dummy book on lupine genealogy. With a soft click, a narrow panel slid back to reveal a hidden compartment where she kept her stolen notes. For months, she had been piecing together a map of the night her father died, cross-referencing guard rotations with old lunar calendars. She felt a strange pull toward the restricted section today, an instinctual tug that bypassed logic entirely. It was as if the very stones of the manor were whispering her name, urging her to find the missing piece of her shattered history. She reached for a leather-bound ledger, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the embossed sigil of the founding families. This was dangerous territory, a place where an Omega had no business being, yet she felt more alive here than she did in the light of day. Because she had nothing left to lose, every risk felt like a victory against the fate that tried to crush her. The sound of the heavy oak doors groaning open sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. Aria didn't have time to retreat to the service door, so she scrambled upward, wedging herself between the top of a mahogany bookshelf and the vaulted ceiling. She pressed her cheek against the cold wood, holding her breath until her lungs burned with the effort. Below her, the rhythmic tap of a cane preceded the entrance of a man, whose presence felt like a physical weight in the room. It wasn't the Alpha, but someone whose scent carried the sharp, biting edge of ozone and old blood. Aria watched through the gap in the woodwork as the figure moved toward the central desk, his movements deliberate and cold. The mystery of his identity gnawed at her, a new thread in the tangled web she was trying to unravel. Chapter 2. The Scent of Fate. The library air grew heavy with a suffocating tension as the mystery figure leafed through documents with a clinical detachment. Aria watched from her high perch, her eyes narrowed as she memorized the way he handled the delicate pages. He was looking for something specific, his frustration mounting with every discarded scroll he threw onto the desk. A low, vibrating growl escaped his throat, a sound so primal it made the very shelves beneath Aria shudder. This wasn't a man who played by the rules of pack diplomacy. He was a predator hunting for a weapon. Just as she prepared to shift her weight to ease a cramp in her leg, the doors swung open again, and the atmosphere shifted from tense to explosive. Alpha Kael entered the room like a storm front, his massive frame blocking out the morning light from the hallway. His presence was a jagged edge of power that sliced through the lingering silence of the library. Aria felt the familiar, terrifying pull of his aura, a magnetic force that demanded submission even from those who hated him. He looked different than he had at the feast. His golden eyes were bloodshot, and his jaw was set in a line of permanent irritation. He moved toward the other man with a predatory stride, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The beta, Silas, didn't even look up as his leader approached, showing a level of disrespect that would have cost anyone else their life. Their argument began in low, heated tones, a rapid-fire exchange of accusations and strategic maneuvers. They spoke of the council, of the rising threat from the southern wastes, and of the embarrassing lack of a Luna to solidify Kael's claim. Aria listened with a mix of fascination and dread, her mind racing to connect these new pieces to her father's death. Every word was a potential key to her freedom, yet every word also brought her closer to a fire she wasn't ready to fight. Kael's voice rose, a thunderous baritone that echoed off the high ceiling, demanding loyalty that Silas seemed hesitant to give. It was a power struggle happening in the dark, a fracture in the foundation of the Silver Moon Pack that Aria never expected to see. Because the Alpha was distracted by his beta's defiance, he failed to notice the small, rhythmic clicking of the clock on the wall. Aria used the sound to mask her own breathing, focusing on the sensory details of the room to keep her panic at bay. She could smell the musk of Kael's wolf, a scent of rain-drenched earth and spicy cedar that felt strangely familiar. It was an intoxicating aroma that shouldn't have affected a lowly Omega, yet it stirred something deep within her soul. Her wolf, dormant and silent for years, let out a ghostly whimper in the back of her mind. This was a biological betrayal she hadn't prepared for, a chemical reaction to a man she was supposed to despise. The confrontation below reached a fever pitch when Silas slammed a heavy book onto the desk, his eyes flashing with a dangerous amber light. He accused Kael of being weak, of letting his search for a fated mate cloud his judgment during a time of war. Kael's response was a blur of movement. He grabbed Silas by the throat and slammed him against the stone fireplace. The sound of bone hitting rock cracked through the room like a whip, followed by the terrifying silence of two apex predators locked in a stalemate. Aria gripped the top of the shelf so hard the wood began to splinter under her fingernails. She was witnessing the private collapse of her enemies, and the sight was both horrifying and magnificent. Kael eventually released his grip, his chest heaving as he struggled to regain control of his shifting form. He turned away from Silas, his gaze wandering toward the very shelves where Aria lay hidden in the shadows. For a heart-stopping second, she thought his eyes locked onto hers, burning through the darkness with an unnatural intensity. She froze, her heart stopping in her chest, waiting for the roar of discovery that would end her life. Instead, Kael simply closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. A look of profound confusion crossed his handsome features, replacing the rage of a moment ago. He moved toward the shelves, his steps slow and deliberate, like a hunter tracking a wounded deer. Silas watched him with a sneer, but Kael ignored him, his focus entirely on the scent that seemed to be haunting him. Aria realized with a jolt of pure terror that her scent suppression herbs must be wearing off from the heat of the library. The realization was a cold bucket of water over her senses, forcing her to make a choice. If she stayed, he would find her and demand answers she wasn't ready to give. If she moved, she would reveal her position and lose the only advantage she had left. The Alpha reached out a hand, his fingers inches away from the mahogany ledge where her arm was tucked. She could see the fine hairs on his wrist, the scars of 100 battles etched into his tan skin. He looked exhausted, haunted by a void that no amount of power or conquest could fill. In that moment, Aria saw the man behind the monster, and the sight was more dangerous than his anger. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to reach out and touch him, to offer a comfort she didn't possess. Then, the beta spoke, breaking the spell and drawing Kael's attention back to the center of the room. Aria took the opportunity to slip backward, retreating into the deeper shadows of the ceiling joists. Chapter 3. The Broken Mask. The morning sun finally broke through the high windows of the library, casting long, dusty fingers of light across the blood-red carpets. Aria waited until the heavy footsteps of the Alpha and his beta had completely faded into the distance before she dared to descend. Her limbs felt like lead, heavy with the residual adrenaline of her near discovery. She dropped to the floor with a soft thud, her knees buckling slightly as her feet made contact with the solid ground. The room felt different now, charged with a lingering energy that made her skin crawl with an electric itch. She needed to get back to the servant quarters before her absence was noted by the head housekeeper, a woman whose cruelty was matched only by her observational skills. As she moved toward the exit, her eyes fell upon a stray piece of parchment that had fallen from Silas's pile during the struggle. It was a list of names, some crossed out in thick black ink, others circled with a frantic hand. Her father's name was at the very bottom, uncrossed and underlined with a jagged stroke that looked like a scar. Aria snatched the paper, tucking it into the bodice of her tunic with trembling hands. This was the proof she had been hunting for, a physical link between the current administration and the massacre of her pack. Because she now possessed this knowledge, her life was forfeit if she was ever searched. The weight of the secret felt like a physical burden, a stone she had to carry through a field of glass. She navigated the back stairs with the practiced ease of a rodent, avoiding the creaky boards and the spots where the light hit the walls. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, spinning between the hatred she felt for the pack and the strange pull she felt toward Kael. Why did his scent affect her so deeply? She had spent years convincing herself that fated mates were a myth used to keep Omegas in line, a fairy tale designed to sugarcoat a life of breeding and submission. Yet, the way her wolf had reacted to him was undeniable, a primal recognition that bypassed every wall she had built around her heart. She hated herself for it, loathed the idea that her soul might be tied to the man who stood at the head of her oppressors. When she reached the servants' kitchen, the air was already thick with the smell of scorched porridge and sour dishwater. The other Omegas moved like automatons, their eyes downcast and their voices hushed to a dull murmur. Aria took her place at the large wooden prep table, picking up a dull knife to begin peeling a mountain of winter potatoes. The repetitive motion helped ground her, providing a rhythm to the chaotic thoughts racing through her head. She watched the other girls, wondering if any of them harbored the same fire she did, or if they had truly been broken by the weight of their chains. It was a lonely existence, being the only one awake in a world of sleepwalkers. The kitchen door swung open with a violent bang, and the head housekeeper, Greta, marched in with a face like curdled milk. She made a direct line for Aria, her narrow eyes scanning for any sign of defiance or sloth. Aria kept her head down, focusing on the brown skin of the potato in her hand, letting her hair fall forward to hide her expression. Greta reached out and shoved Aria's shoulder, a casual display of dominance that nearly sent the girl into the dirty water of the sink. Aria didn't fight back. She simply absorbed the blow and continued her work, a masterclass in the art of being nothing. Because the house was preparing for the Alpha Council, the workload had tripled and the tension among the staff was reaching a breaking point. Greta barked orders about silver polishing and linen changes, her voice a grating screech that set Aria's teeth on edge. Amidst the chaos, Aria overheard a group of maids whispering about a new arrival, a powerful alpha from the north who was bringing a retinue of warriors. The rumors were flying like wildfire, each one more sensational than the last. Some said he was coming to challenge Kael for the territory. Others claimed he was here to negotiate a marriage alliance. Every new variable made Aria's plan more complicated, a shifting landscape that required constant recalibration. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, a sudden horn blast echoed from the main gates, signaling the arrival of the first delegation. The kitchen erupted into a frenzy of activity as platters of roasted meat and heavy flagons of wine were prepped for the welcoming feast. Aria was tasked with carrying a heavy tray of glassware up to the grand hall, a job that would put her right in the middle of the lion's den. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her tattered apron and checking the hidden parchment in her tunic. This was the moment she had to be the most invisible, yet the most observant. The grand hall was a cavern of gold and shadow, filled with the sense of a dozen different packs clashing in the air. Aria moved through the crowd like a shadow, her eyes darting between the faces of the powerful men who held her world in their hands. She saw Kael at the head of the long table, looking every bit the king he was, his golden eyes scanning the room with a restless energy. For a brief second, their gazes met as she set a glass down near his elbow. The world seemed to stop, the noise of the crowd fading into a dull roar in her ears. He looked at her not as a servant, but as something else, a puzzle he was determined to solve. Aria quickly looked away, her heart hammering against the parchment in her chest, realizing that the game had officially begun. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The atmosphere within the Alpha's estate had shifted from organized chaos to a suffocating pressure cooker. With the arrival of the northern delegates, the very air in the corridors seemed to vibrate with the scent of rival wolves, a metallic and earthy tang that triggered Aria's survival instincts. She moved through the service tunnels, her hands raw from the caustic lye used to scrub the extra linens. Every muscle ached, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the searing heat of the parchment tucked against her skin. Because the house was crawling with high-ranked trackers, she had spent the last 3 hours practicing a mental shroud, burying her scent under the heavy, cloying aroma of the kitchen's grease. Her task was to restock the firewood in the Alpha's private study, a room she usually avoided like a den of vipers. The hallway leading to his quarters was lined with tapestries depicting the moon goddess's first blessing, their silver threads shimmering in the flickering torchlight. Aria kept her chin tucked, the heavy wicker basket of cedar logs balanced on her hip to hide the slight tremble in her hands. As she approached the heavy oak door, she heard the muffled sound of a heated argument from within. It wasn't the political maneuvering of the council, but something far more intimate and dangerous. Kael's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that she felt in the marrow of her bones. Stepping into the room, she kept her gaze fixed on the hearth, determined to be the ghost they expected. The study was a mess of discarded maps and empty crystal decanters, evidence of a man losing his grip on a peaceful transition. Kael stood by the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising moon, while Silas paced the rug like a caged animal. Neither of them acknowledged her entrance, their focus locked on a small obsidian vial sitting on the desk. Silas was arguing that the Northern Alpha wouldn't accept a mateless leader, and that Kael needed to choose a highborn female before the moon reached its peak. The blatant talk of breeding and political bargaining made Aria's stomach churn with a cold, familiar disgust. The weight of the firewood felt like a mountain as she knelt by the fireplace, her fingers grazing the cold stone. She worked with a frantic, silent efficiency, desperate to leave before the conversation turned to something she couldn't ignore. Just as she reached for the last log, her foot caught on the edge of the heavy fur rug. It was a momentary lapse, a split second where her carefully maintained mask of invisibility slipped. The basket tipped, a single log rolling across the floor with a hollow thud that sounded like a gunshot in the tense room. Aria froze, her breath hitching in her throat as the silence stretched thin enough to snap. Kael turned slowly, his golden eyes narrowing as they landed on the girl kneeling in the shadows of his hearth. For the first time, he didn't look through her. He looked at her, his pupils dilating until the gold was nearly swallowed by black. The scent she had tried so hard to bury, the scent of silver-tinged rain and wild jasmine, seemed to explode in the small space. It was a chemical reaction so violent it made the glass decanters on the side table rattle. Because the bond had been suppressed for so long, the sudden release was like a physical blow to both of them. Aria felt a surge of warmth bloom in her chest, a terrifying connection that pulsed in time with Kael's frantic heartbeat. Silas stopped pacing, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the sudden shift in the air. A slow, predatory smile spread across the beta's face, a look of pure, calculated malice that made the hair on Aria's arms stand up. He looked from the alpha to the trembling servant, the realization of the truth clicking into place behind his eyes. Kael took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch a dream, his voice a broken whisper that barely carried across the rug. He called her a name she hadn't heard in years, a name that belonged to the girl who died in the fire with her father. Aria didn't wait for him to finish. She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door, the wicker basket forgotten in the dust. Chapter 5. The Hunter and the Ghost. The cold night air hit Aria's face like a physical slap as she burst through the kitchen gardens and headed for the darkness of the forest. She didn't look back, even when she heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of a large animal crashing through the underbrush behind her. Her lungs burned with the effort of her flight, every breath a jagged blade of ice in her chest. Because she was an Omega, she shouldn't have been able to outrun an Alpha, yet her legs moved with a frantic ancestral strength. The trees blurred past her in a smear of silver and black, the moon providing just enough light to navigate the treacherous roots and hidden ravines. She wasn't just running from a man. She was running from a destiny that promised to consume her whole. A sudden weight hit her from behind, a massive force that sent her tumbling into a bed of damp moss and pine needles. Aria rolled, her hands coming up to claw at the thick fur of the wolf pinning her down. It was Kael, but not the man she had seen in the study. This was his wolf, a towering beast of midnight fur and molten eyes. He didn't growl or snap his jaws. He simply stood over her, his heavy paws on either side of her shoulders pinning her to the earth. The heat radiating from his body was a furnace in the winter chill, a primal comfort that her own body craved despite her mind's frantic protests. She looked up into his eyes, seeing the raw agony and desperate hope reflected in those golden depths. The transformation was a brutal, beautiful symphony of snapping bone and shifting muscle as Kael returned to his human form. He didn't move away, staying draped over her as he gasped for air, his skin humming with the residual energy of the shift. Aria felt the rough texture of his calloused hands as they cupped her face, forcing her to look at him. He demanded to know why she had stayed hidden, why she had allowed him to believe she was a ghost for 5 long years. His voice was thick with a cocktail of rage and relief, a sound that broke through the last of her defenses. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him about the fire and the betrayal, but the words were choked by the sudden, overwhelming power of the bond. Kael's thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch leaving a trail of fire in its wake that made her entire body tremble. He told her that he had searched every corner of the territory for her, that the scent of her soul had haunted his dreams every night since the massacre. Because he was an Alpha, he wasn't used to vulnerability, yet here he was, baring his heart to a servant in the middle of a dark wood. Aria felt the tears she had held back for half a decade finally spill over, hot and bitter against her cheeks. She realized then that her invisibility hadn't been a shield. It had been a prison that kept them both in the dark. The enemy wasn't just the traitor who killed her father, but the silence she had used to survive. Just as the tension between them reached a breaking point, a low, mocking whistle echoed through the trees. Silas stepped out from behind a massive oak, his hands tucked into his pockets and a look of bored amusement on his face. He congratulated Kael on finally finding his little lost lamb, but his tone suggested that the discovery was a death sentence rather than a miracle. He reminded the Alpha that the Council would never accept a mate who was an Omega, especially one whose family had been branded as traitors. The reminder was a bucket of ice water over the budding flame of their connection, snapping Aria back to the harsh reality of their world. Silas wasn't just a witness. He was a predator who had just found the ultimate leverage. Kael stood up, his body shielding Aria from the beta's gaze, his posture screaming of protective fury. He told Silas to leave, his voice a low snarl that made the surrounding birds take flight in a panicked flurry. Silas didn't flinch. He simply pointed out that the Northern Alpha was already waiting in the hall, and that rumors of Kael's Omega obsession would spread before morning. He suggested that Aria should be disposed of for the good of the pack, a casual suggestion that made Aria's blood run cold. She saw the flick of hesitation in Kael's eyes, a split second where the leader warred with the mate. It was all the confirmation she needed to know that love wouldn't be enough to save her. Chapter 6. The Gilded Cage. By the time they returned to the estate, the power dynamics of the house had been irrevocably shattered. Kael didn't send Aria back to the kitchens. Instead, he marched her through the front doors and up to the high-status guest wing. The servants they passed dropped their trays in shock, their eyes wide as they witnessed the Alpha holding the hand of the girl who usually cleaned their boots. Aria felt like a specimen under a microscope, the heat of 100 stares burning into her skin. Because Kael refused to let go, she was forced to walk with her head held high, a hollow mockery of the Luna she was supposed to be. The luxury of the guest suite, the silk sheets and the marble bath, felt like a gilded cage designed to keep her contained. Kael stayed with her for hours, paced the room as he issued orders to a confused beta who wasn't Silas. He brought her food she couldn't eat and water that tasted like dust, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He was terrified that if he left her side, she would vanish back into the shadows like a dream at dawn. Aria sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery of the duvet, her mind 1,000 miles away. She thought about the list of names in her tunic and the way Silas had looked at her in the woods. The beta knew who she was, and he knew that her presence was the only thing that could topple Kael's reign. As the moon reached its zenith, Kael finally sat beside her, the weight of his body sinking the mattress. He spoke of the future, of a world where she didn't have to hide, but his words felt like a fantasy woven from smoke. He told her that he would challenge anyone who questioned her rank, but Aria knew the laws of the Great Packs were written in blood and tradition. An Alpha without a strong mate was a target, and an Omega mate was a weakness that would be exploited by every rival in the territory. She looked at him, seeing the desperate love in his eyes, and felt a profound sense of pity for the man who thought he could fight the world for her. Because she loved him, she knew she had to be the one to protect him, even if it meant breaking her own heart. The door to the suite opened without a knock, and a woman dressed in the furs of the north stepped inside. She was beautiful, with hair the color of moonlight and eyes like chips of glacial ice. This was the Alpha of the Frost Bite Pack, a woman who had come to claim a seat at the council and, potentially, a place in Kael's bed. She looked at Aria with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, her scent a sharp, biting wind that filled the room. She didn't say a word to the servant, addressing Kael as if Aria were nothing more than a piece of furniture. The disrespect was a calculated move, a reminder that in the world of high politics, Aria's feelings were irrelevant. Kael rose to meet her, his jaw set in a hard line, but the Northern Alpha simply laughed at his display of protection. She pointed out that the council was already whispering about the servant girl and that Kael's reputation was bleeding out in the hallways. She offered him a deal: send the girl away and marry into the north, and she would provide the warriors needed to crush the rising rebellion. It was a cold, logical trade that made perfect sense to everyone except the man who had just found his soul. Aria watched the play of emotions on Kael's face, seeing the heavy burden of leadership war with the fire of the bond. The silence in the room was a heavy cloak, suffocating the hope she had allowed herself to feel. Aria stood up, her voice small but steady as she addressed the room for the first time. She told Kael that she wouldn't be the reason his pack fell, that she would return to the shadows where she belonged. The words felt like ash in her mouth, but they were the only weapons she had left to guard him. Kael turned to her, a look of pure betrayal in his eyes, his hand reaching out to stop her. Before he could speak, the sound of a distant explosion rocked the manor, the floor beneath them bucking like a living thing. The rebellion hadn't waited for the council to conclude. The war had arrived at their doorstep. Chapter 7. Crimson Snow. The shockwave from the explosion shattered the stained glass windows of the guest wing, showering the silk sheets in 1,000 glittering diamonds of jagged light. Aria was thrown against the mahogany bedpost, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs and leaving a metallic tang of blood in her mouth. Because she had spent years anticipating a disaster, she didn't scream. She simply rolled to the floor and sought the cover of the shadows beneath the heavy velvet drapes. Outside, the serene moonlight was drowned out by the orange flicker of a growing inferno, and the rhythmic howling of 100 werewolves tore through the night. The Silver Moon Estate, once a fortress of silent secrets, was now a slaughterhouse in the making. Kael was on his feet instantly, his transition half complete as fur sprouted along his jaw and his fingernails lengthened into lethal ebony claws. He looked toward Aria, a raw, primal protective instinct flaring in his eyes that almost made her forget the fire raging outside. He moved to reach for her, but the Northern Alpha grabbed his arm, her expression a mask of ruthless pragmatism as she urged him toward the tactical maps. She hissed that his pack was being gutted from the inside, and that a leader who stayed to protect a mate while his warriors died was a leader who wouldn't survive the hour. Aria saw the agonizing fracture in Kael's soul as he looked between his duty and his heart, a moment of hesitation that nearly cost him everything. A second blast rocked the foundation, closer this time, and the heavy oak doors of the suite were kicked inward by 3 warriors wearing the black and gray sigil of the traitorous faction. They didn't come for the Alpha. They ignored Kael entirely, their predatory gazes locked onto the Omega girl huddled by the window. It was a calculated strike, a move designed to cripple Kael's resolve by threatening the one thing he couldn't bear to lose. Aria felt the familiar spark of cold, calculating fury ignite in her gut, a fire that had been smoldering since the night her father died. She wasn't the helpless servant they expected, and the secret parchment tucked against her skin felt like a brand, reminding her of the bloodline she carried. Before the first intruder could bridge the gap, Aria snatched a heavy crystal carafe from the nightstand and shattered it against the edge of the marble fireplace. She didn't cower. She stepped into the light, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the burning gardens with a fierce intensity. Kael let out a deafening roar of pride and rage, launching himself at the nearest warrior with a speed that defied the human eye. The room became a blur of silver fur, crimson sprays, and the sickening sound of tearing sinew. Aria moved with a fluid, lethal grace she had practiced in the dark corners of the library, using the jagged glass to slash at the throat of a wolf who dared to underestimate her. The Northern Alpha watched the scene with a sudden, sharp interest, her icy eyes widening as she realized the servant was fighting with the precision of a trained guardian. Because Aria had watched every training session from the attic windows for 5 years, she knew the blind spots of the pack's combat style. She moved low, dodging a heavy swing and driving her makeshift weapon into the soft underbelly of her opponent. The warrior collapsed, a look of pure shock on his face as he realized he had been bested by an Omega. This was the first time Aria had allowed her power to be seen, and the feeling was more intoxicating than any mate bond. Chapter 8. The Silver Shadow. The chaos of the manor spilled out into the courtyard, where the scent of ozone and wet fur was thick enough to taste. Kael had forced Aria to stay behind his line of loyal enforcers, but the battlefield was a fluid thing that didn't respect the boundaries of protection. Every time a gap opened in the defense, Aria was there, using her knowledge of the estate's hidden passages to flank the attackers. She moved through the smoke like a vengeful spirit, her tattered servant's dress stained with the lifeblood of men who had spent years calling her worthless. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was reclaiming the identity that had been buried under 5 years of dust and silence. Aria found herself separated from Kael as the fighting surged toward the western gate, where the shadows of the ancient oaks provided the perfect cover for the rebels. She heard a familiar, oily laugh echoing from the darkness, a sound that made her blood run cold and her wolf snarl in the back of her mind. Silas emerged from the gloom, his blades dripping with red and his eyes glowing with a treacherous, sickly amber light. He looked at Aria not as a nuisance, but as the final obstacle between him and the Alpha's throne. He taunted her, claiming that her father had been just as arrogant before he watched his world burn, a revelation that confirmed Silas's hand in the massacre. The rage that surged through Aria was a physical weight, a pressure behind her eyes that threatened to shatter her human form. She didn't have a sword or a claw, but she had the environment, and she knew these woods better than any man who walked them. Because Silas was focused on his own superiority, he didn't notice the snare she had kicked into place or the way she was baiting him toward the ravine. She led him on a frantic chase through the underbrush, her movements a rhythmic dance of evasion and strike. Every time he lunged, she was a second faster, a shadow that slipped through his fingers like smoke in the wind. Kael's voice echoed through the trees, a desperate, lung-tearing call for his mate that nearly broke Aria's concentration. She could hear the panic in his tone, the sound of a man who believed he was losing his soul to the dark. She wanted to answer him, to run to the safety of his arms, but Silas was a cancer that had to be cut from the pack. The beta caught her near the edge of the cliff, his hand wrapping around her throat with a crushing force that lifted her off her feet. He hissed that the silver moon would rise under a real alpha and that her death would be the foundation of his new empire. Aria felt the world beginning to fade at the edges, the lack of oxygen making her limbs feel heavy and disconnected. Just as the darkness threatened to take her, she remembered the way her father had looked in the fire, not defeated, but defiant. She reached up, her fingers finding the sensitive pressure point at the base of Silas's thumb, and she bit down with a primal ferocity. The beta let out a yelp of pain, his grip loosening just enough for Aria to drive her elbow into his solar plexus. She didn't stop there. She used his own momentum to twist his arm, a move she had seen 1,000 times in the library's ancient combat manuals. Chapter 9. The Luna's Choice. The struggle on the clifftop ended not with a roar, but with a sickening crunch as Kael collided with Silas like a runaway freight train. The Alpha had found them just as Aria was being backed into the abyss, and his arrival was a cataclysmic event that shook the very trees. He didn't use a weapon. He used his bare hands, his fury a tangible thing that darkened the air around him. He slammed Silas into the earth with a force that cracked the bedrock, his claws hovering inches from the traitor's throat. The beta was broken, his arrogance replaced by a whimpering terror as he realized that the bond between an alpha and his fated mate was a power he could never understand. Kael turned to Aria, his eyes searching hers for any sign of injury, his hands shaking as he touched her blood-stained face. He begged for her forgiveness, blaming his own blindness for the years of suffering she had endured under his roof. Aria looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see a master or a king. She saw her equal. Because they had survived the fire together, the hierarchy of Alpha and Omega felt like a distant, meaningless dream. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the blood-stained parchment, the list of names that proved the treachery of the council and the innocence of her father. The Northern Alpha and the remaining loyalists emerged from the woods, their weapons lowered as they witnessed the aftermath of the duel. The air was silent now, the only sound the crackle of the dying fires and the distant, mourning howls for the fallen. Kael took the parchment, his eyes scanning the names with a cold, righteous fury that promised a new era of justice for the Silver Moon. He looked at his people, then at the girl who had saved them all from the shadows, and he made a choice that would change their laws forever. He didn't ask her to be his mate. He asked her to be his partner, a leader who earned her place through blood and grit. Aria stood tall, the wind from the ravine whipping her hair around her face like a silver crown. She realized that the invisibility she had used as a shield was gone, replaced by a light so bright it was terrifying. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the architect of a new world. Would the other packs accept a Luna who had scrubbed their floors? She didn't care. Because she had found her voice, she would make them listen, one way or another. The journey from the kitchen to the throne was complete, but the real war for their future was only just beginning. Kael reached out his hand, an unspoken question in his eyes as the first rays of dawn began to paint the horizon in shades of violet and gold. Aria took it, her fingers interlocking with his, feeling the steady, rhythmic thrum of their combined power. The pack watched in a stunned, reverent silence as their alpha led the girl from the shadows back toward the manor. They didn't see an Omega. They saw a woman who had faced the darkness and forced it to blink. The silver moon had finally found its light, and as the sun rose over the scarred landscape, Aria knew that for the first time in 5 years, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 10. The Serpent's Coil. The morning after the coup attempt felt like waking up inside a bruised ribcage. Aria sat by the window of the Alpha's private solar, the heavy velvet curtains pulled back to reveal a courtyard that looked like a jagged scar on the earth. Maintenance crews were already hauling away the charred remains of the western gate, their movements sluggish under the weight of the previous night's trauma. Because the pack house was still technically a crime scene, the scent of spent gunpowder and burnt hair lingered in the vents, a stubborn reminder that safety was an illusion. Aria traced the mahogany grain of the desk with a fingertip, her skin still humming from the adrenaline that refused to leave her system. Kael walked in, his presence a warm tide that momentarily pushed back the cold dread pooling in her stomach. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a century, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and his hair a wild tangle of gold and shadow. He placed a heavy iron key on the desk between them, a symbol of the records room where the rest of her father's history lay buried. He told her that the council would arrive by noon, and that the Northern Alpha was already demanding a formal inquiry into the Omega's role in the defense. The irony wasn't lost on Aria. She had saved their lives, yet they were more concerned with the purity of her bloodline than the blood she had spilled for them. Determined to find the missing link in the parchment she'd recovered, Aria spent the next few hours submerged in the dust of the archives. She found the ledger from the year of the massacre, its pages yellowed and brittle like old bone. As she flipped through the records of trade agreements and border skirmishes, she noticed a recurring signature next to the supply requisitions for the southern border. It wasn't Silas's name, but a seal she didn't recognize, a serpent coiled around a broken moon. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The trader wasn't just a disgruntled beta, but part of a larger syndicate that had been draining the pack's resources for years. Because she was now hyper-aware of every shift in the house's energy, she heard the soft click of the archive door long before it swung open. She didn't turn around, keeping her eyes fixed on the ledger while her hand drifted toward the silver letter opener on the desk. A woman's voice, silkier and more dangerous than Silas's growl, echoed through the narrow rows of shelves. It was the beta's sister, Alara, a woman who had always treated Aria with a detached, cold indifference that was worse than outright cruelty. She asked Aria if she truly believed a piece of paper would be enough to topple a system that had existed for 1,000 years. Alara moved into the light, her eyes reflecting the dim glow of the lanterns with a calculating, predatory shimmer. She didn't look like a traitor. She looked like a grieving sister. Yet her scent carried the faint, acrid tang of the same poison that had been used on the border patrols. She revealed that Silas was merely a foot soldier in a game that spanned all 5 great packs, a game where Aria was nothing more than a convenient distraction. The threat was subtle, a whisper of consequences that would befall Kael if Aria continued her investigation. Why did the powerful always think that the small were easy to silence? Aria stood her ground, the weight of her father's memory giving her a backbone of reinforced steel. Chapter 11. The Council of Wolves. The grand hall was a sea of fur, gold, and bared teeth as the 5 alphas took their seats at the high table. The air was a suffocating pressure cooker of competing auras, each one vying for dominance in a room that felt too small for such concentrated power. Aria stood at Kael's right hand, her presence a silent challenge to the traditions they held dear. She wore a dress of deep midnight blue, a color that made her silver-flecked eyes pop with an intensity that unsettled the older men in the room. They looked at her as if she were a glitch in the natural order, a servant who had forgotten her place and needed to be reminded of it with a heavy hand. Kael opened the session not with a plea for peace, but with a declaration of war against the rot within their own ranks. He laid the blood-stained parchment on the table, the names of the traitors staring back at the council like a death warrant. A low murmur of dissent rippled through the room, a sound like distant thunder before a storm breaks. The Alpha of the Southern Reach, a man whose face was a map of old scars, laughed at the evidence, claiming that a scrub girl's word was worth less than the dirt on his boots. Because the system was built on hierarchy, the truth was irrelevant if it came from the bottom of the ladder. Aria felt the anger rising in her chest, a heat that felt like molten silver flowing through her veins. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the masculine posturing like a blade through silk. She didn't ask for their respect. She demanded their attention, recounting the details of the attack with a precision that left no room for doubt. She spoke of the serpent seal and the missing requisitions, connecting the dots that they had spent years ignoring. The room fell into a stunned silence as they realized that the Omega knew more about their internal logistics than their own betas. It was a midpoint revelation that shifted the gravity of the entire council. The Northern Alpha, who had been watching Aria with a hawk-like intensity, suddenly stood up and declared her support for the inquiry. She wasn't doing it out of the goodness of her heart, but because she recognized a winning side when she saw one. This support created a fracture in the council's unity, a divide that Kael immediately exploited with the ruthlessness of a seasoned hunter. He pointed out that if one pack was compromised, they were all at risk, and that the Serpent Syndicate wouldn't stop until every Alpha was a puppet. The high-stakes conflict intensified as accusations began to fly across the table, old grudges surfacing like drowned bodies in a flood. Just as the council reached a fever pitch of debate, the doors to the hall were thrown open and a breathless scout staggered in, his armor coated in a layer of gray ash. He gasped out that the southern border was being overrun by a force that didn't belong to any known pack, a horde of rogues led by a man wearing the serpent sigil. The revelation was the final nail in the coffin of the old order. The enemy wasn't coming. The enemy was already here. Kael grabbed his sword, his eyes locking onto Aria's with a silent promise of protection and a plea for her strength. The meeting was over. The war for survival had officially begun. Chapter 12. The Shadow's Truth. The trek to the southern border was a frantic blur of hoofbeats and the rhythmic breathing of 100 wolves in mid-shift. Aria rode beside Kael, her hands tight on the reins as the cold wind whipped her hair into a silver frenzy. She felt the weight of the letter opener in her boot and the stolen ledger in her pack, the physical evidence of the lie they were fighting. Because the rogues were attacking in broad daylight, the usual rules of engagement were discarded in favor of raw, primal survival. The forest was a maze of smoke and screams, the trees themselves seeming to weep as the conflict tore through their roots. Aria found herself separated from the main force when a group of serpent-marked warriors ambushed their flank near the old stone bridge. She was forced into a narrow ravine, the steep walls of damp moss and jagged shale trapping her like a bird in a cage. Her opponent was a man she recognized from the archives, the former captain of the guard who had vanished on the night of the fire. He didn't growl. He spoke with a calm, terrifying lucidity, telling her that her father had been the one to start the syndicate. The claim was a jagged piece of glass in her heart, a twist she never saw coming. He laughed as he saw the shock on her face, claiming that her father had realized the packs were dying and had tried to create a new world where rank didn't matter. The massacre wasn't a betrayal of his loyalty, but a purge of his failed experiment. Aria felt her world tilt on its axis, the foundation of her revenge crumbling into a pile of ash. Was she fighting for a hero, or was she the daughter of the monster who had birthed the serpent? The psychological blow was more devastating than any physical wound, leaving her vulnerable as the captain lunged with a curved obsidian blade. She dodged the strike by instinct alone, her body moving even as her mind drifted in a sea of despair. Because she had lived as a shadow for so long, she knew how to find the light even in the deepest cave. She realized that even if the story was true, it didn't change the man Kael was or the woman she had become. Her father's sins weren't her own, and the Serpent Syndicate was a perversion of whatever vision he might have had. She caught the captain's wrist, her strength surprising both of them, and she used his own momentum to drive him back against the stone wall. Kael burst through the underbrush a moment later, his wolf form a towering shadow of protection that sent the remaining rogues into a panicked retreat. He shifted back to human form, his eyes searching hers for the truth of what had happened in the ravine. Aria didn't tell him about the captain's claim. Not yet. The secret was a new burden, a hook that would pull at her until she found the courage to face it. As they stood amidst the carnage of the border, the sun setting in a bloody smear across the sky, she realized that the war wasn't just about territory. It was a war for the truth of their history, and she was the only one with the key to unlock it. Chapter 13. The Weight of Silence. The southern border smoldered under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, the air thick with the copper tang of blood and the acrid stench of scorched earth. Aria sat on a fallen cedar log, her hands trembling as she tried to wipe the grime from her face. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but the physical agony was a dull hum compared to the roaring chaos in her mind. The captain's words echoed in her skull, like a recurring nightmare, threatening to dismantle the very identity she had spent 5 years meticulously rebuilding. Was she the daughter of a visionary or the legacy of a traitor? Because the truth felt like a jagged blade in her gut, she couldn't bring herself to look at Kael as he strode toward her through the thinning smoke. Kael knelt before her, his massive hands reaching out to steady her shaking shoulders with a tenderness that felt like a physical blow. He searched her eyes for a wound he could heal, oblivious to the fact that the damage was etched into her soul. He told her that the border was secure for now, but the serpent-marked warriors were retreating to the mountains, likely to regroup for a final assault on the Alpha House. He spoke of their future, of the peace they would build once the rot was purged, but his words felt like ash in her mouth. How could she stand beside him as a Luna, when her own bloodline might be the source of the plague infecting his pack? The secret was a poison, a slow-acting toxin that made every heartbeat feel like a countdown to her own destruction. Determined to find the truth before it found her, Aria waited until the camp fell into the uneasy silence of the exhausted. She slipped away from the warmth of Kael's side, her movements a fluid ghost dance through the sleeping warriors. She returned to the ravine where the captain's body lay, his obsidian blade still clutched in a death grip. She searched his pockets, her fingers brushing against a cold, metallic object hidden in the lining of his tunic. It was a signet ring, the serpent coiled around a broken moon, but on the inside of the band, a name was engraved in delicate script: Alistair. Her father's name. The confirmation hit her with the force of a landslide, burying her hope under a mountain of undeniable reality. Because she was a creature of the shadows, she didn't collapse into tears. She hardened like cooling lava. She realized that the revolt 5 years ago wasn't an attack on her family, but a desperate attempt by the other packs to stop her father's radical expansion. The fire that killed him had been a mercy, a way to end the madness before it consumed the entire territory. Aria felt a sudden, sharp clarity as she looked at the ring in her palm. Her father hadn't been a victim, he had been the architect of his own demise, and she was the accidental survivor of a war he had started. The question now was whether she would continue his work, or be the one to finally burn the blueprints. Chapter 14. The Public Declaration. The return to the Silver Moon Manor was not a homecoming, but a march toward a final confrontation. Kael had sent word ahead, summoning the remaining pack members to the Great Hall for a public declaration of his intent. He wanted the world to see that the era of Omegas living in the shadows was over, unaware that the girl he was championing was carrying the mark of their greatest enemy. Aria walked beside him, her head held high and her jaw set in a mask of regal defiance. She wore the deep blue dress again, but this time, the serpent ring was tucked into the hidden pocket of her skirt, a cold weight against her thigh. The hall was packed to the rafters, a sea of faces reflecting a mixture of hope, fear, and simmering resentment. Kael took his place on the dais, his voice a booming resonance that filled every corner of the vast stone chamber. He spoke of the courage Aria had shown on the border, of the way she had outfought seasoned warriors to protect the pack. He declared her his fated mate, his voice ringing with a conviction that brought tears to the eyes of the younger wolves. The pack let out a collective howl of approval, a sound of raw, primal joy that shook the very foundation of the building. For a fleeting moment, Aria allowed herself to believe in the dream, to feel the warmth of the bond as it hummed between them. But as she looked out over the crowd, she saw Alara standing in the shadows of the balcony, a knowing, cruel smile playing on her lips. The beta's sister didn't wait for the applause to die down before she stepped into the light, her voice a sharp, piercing blade that sliced through the celebration. She challenged the Alpha's choice, not on the basis of rank, but on the basis of blood. She held up a series of documents she had discovered in the Southern archives, papers that detailed her father's involvement in the syndicate's founding. The room fell into a silence so profound, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the hall. Kael looked at the papers, then at Aria, a flicker of doubt dancing in his golden eyes like a dying candle. Why didn't she deny it? The question was written on every face in the room, a silent accusation that grew louder with every second of her silence. Aria stepped forward, her voice steady despite the hammer pulse in her throat. She admitted that her father was the man Alara claimed him to be, but she refused to let his sins define her existence. She told the pack that she had lived in their shadows for 5 years, cleaning their floors and absorbing their hate, yet she was the one who had bled for them on the stone bridge. She asked them if they valued a name more than the actions of the person carrying it, a question that prompted a wave of uneasy murmurs. The high-stakes conflict had reached its zenith. It was no longer a war for territory, but a war for the soul of the Silver Moon. Chapter 15. The Accelerating Coup. The declaration didn't end in a celebration, but in a fractured house. Kael had refused to cast Aria out, but the seeds of suspicion had been sown deep into the pack's foundation. As the moon reached its peak, a sudden, frantic barking from the kennel mews signaled the start of the final betrayal. Alara hadn't just been looking for documents. She had been coordinating with the serpent-marked warriors who had infiltrated the estate during the council. The coup was no longer a distant threat. It was a living, breathing monster that was tearing the manor apart from the inside. Aria heard the sound of breaking glass from the floor below, followed by the terrifying, familiar scent of the southern poison. She found Kael in the tactical room, his face a mask of grim determination as he issued orders to a dwindling group of loyalists. He didn't look at her with suspicion. He looked at her with a desperate, frantic love that broke her heart. He told her that Silas had escaped his cell and was leading a force toward the nursery, a move designed to strike at the heart of the pack's future. Aria realized then that the only way to stop the carnage was to face her father's legacy head-on. She told Kael she was going to the southern gate, the primary entry point for the syndicate. But her real goal was the archive where the serpent's heart still beat. Because the manor was a maze of smoke and shadow, Aria was able to navigate the corridors without being detected by the invaders. She reached the archives just as Alara was preparing to set fire to the records, a desperate attempt to bury the evidence of her own family's involvement in the syndicate. The two women faced each other amidst the rows of ancient scrolls, their eyes reflecting the orange flicker of the encroaching flames. Alara spat that Aria was a fool for thinking she could ever be a Luna, that the world would always see her as the daughter of a traitor. Aria didn't argue. She simply moved with the lethal, silent grace of a shadow, her hand finding the silver letter opener in her boot. The struggle was a blur of silk and steel, a rhythmic clash of two women fighting for their version of the truth. Aria felt the heat of the fire on her back, the scent of burning parchment filling her lungs with a suffocating dry heat. She realized that she wasn't just fighting Alara. She was fighting the ghost of her father and the 5 years of silence that had nearly consumed her. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she disarmed the beta's sister and pinned her against a burning shelf. She didn't kill her. She forced her to look at the serpent ring, the physical proof of the poison they had both inherited. "The cycle ends today," Aria whispered, her voice a cold, final judgment. The building groaned as a support beam collapsed, the floor beneath them bucking like a dying animal. Aria left Alara to the mercy of the flames and raced toward the Great Hall, where she could hear Kael's roar of agony. She arrived just in time to see Silas drive a poisoned blade into the Alpha's side, a move that sent Kael to his knees in a spray of crimson. The war wasn't over, and as Aria watched her mate collapse, she felt a power awakening in her blood that she had never known existed. The girl who had survived by hiding was gone. The woman who would save the pack was finally here. Chapter 16. The Gravity of Guilt. The world collapsed into a singular, agonizing point of focus as Kael hit the flagstones, the sound of his body striking the floor echoing like the death of a kingdom. Aria's scream was trapped in her throat, a suffocating knot of terror that robbed her of breath. Around her, the great hall had dissolved into a chaotic swirl of silver and shadow, but for Aria, the only thing that existed was the sight of the dark, iridescent liquid weeping from the wound in Kael's side. Because the serpent's poison was designed to target the Alpha bloodline, his skin was already gray, his veins standing out like blackened vines against his throat. Silas stood over him, his face twisted into a mask of triumphant madness as he raised his blade for the final decapitating strike. Desperation lent Aria a speed that bypassed the limitations of her Omega rank. She didn't think. She acted, throwing herself between the dying Alpha and the traitor with a ferocity that caught Silas off guard. She wasn't a warrior, but she was a woman who had survived 5 years of hell, and that made her more dangerous than any trained soldier. Her hands, calloused from years of scrubbing and scouring, found purchase on Silas's wrist, her fingers digging into the bone with a strength born of pure, unadulterated love. Silas laughed, a hollow, rattling sound that filled the air with the stench of his betrayal, and he shoved her backward into the pooling blood of her mate. Aria's head struck the edge of the dais, and for a terrifying second, the world went white. When her vision cleared, she saw Silas being dragged away by a wave of loyalists, but the victory felt hollow as she looked back at Kael. His heartbeat was a faint, irregular drumming beneath her palm, a fading rhythm that signaled the end of his life. She felt the weight of her father's ring in her pocket, a cold reminder that her family's legacy was the very weapon killing the man she loved. Why had fate brought them together only to tear them apart with the ghosts of the past? The question was a physical ache in her chest, a wound that no medicine could reach. As the loyalists pushed the invaders back toward the gates, Aria found herself alone in a circle of flickering torchlight, holding the heavy head of the Alpha in her lap. She whispered his name, her voice a broken thread of hope in the gathering dark, but he didn't answer. His golden eyes were glazed, staring at a ceiling he would never see again, and his hand, once so strong, lay limp in the crimson puddle. Because she had spent her life vanishing, Aria felt herself slipping into that familiar, numb void where nothing could hurt her. She realized that her greatest mistake wasn't the secret she kept, but the belief that she could ever be more than a harbinger of death. Chapter 17. The Shadow of the Citadel. The dungeons of the Silver Moon were a labyrinth of weeping stone and ancient iron, a place where the sun never dared to penetrate. Aria had been moved there by the Northern Alpha's personal guard, a protective custody that felt suspiciously like an executioner's weight. They had taken her ring, her ledger, and the last of her dignity, leaving her in a cell that smelled of damp earth and old despair. She sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the rhythmic drip of water from the ceiling. Outside her bars, the guards spoke in hushed, fearful tones about the Alpha's declining state and the inevitable collapse of the pack. Silas appeared in the shadows of the corridor, his face pale and his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. He wasn't there to gloat. He was there because the syndicate had turned on him the moment Kael fell. He leaned against the cold bars, his voice a trembling whisper that carried the weight of a man who knew he was already a ghost. He told Aria that the poison was a variant of the one her father had developed, a toxin that required a specific antidote hidden within the foundations of the old citadel. He offered her a deal, his freedom for the location of the cure, a final treacherous bargain from a man who had already sold his soul twice over. Aria looked at him, seeing the pathetic remains of the warrior who had nearly destroyed her life. She realized that the hate she felt for him was a fire that had burnt itself out, leaving nothing but the cold ash of pragmatism. If she accepted his help, she was validating his betrayal. If she refused, Kael would die before the sun reached its zenith. Because she loved the Alpha more than she loathed the traitor, she nodded her head, a silent pact that felt like a death warrant for her conscience. Silas used a hidden lockpick to open the cell door, and the two enemies stepped out into the dark, a pair of shadows fleeing into the night. The journey to the citadel was a nightmare of evasion and narrow escapes, the manor now a maze of serpent patrols and dying loyalists. Aria moved with a silent, predatory grace, her senses tuned to the frequency of the hunt. She felt the absence of the mate bond like a missing limb, a cold vacuum in her chest where Kael's presence used to be. The citadel was a ruin of black basalt and ivy, a place that had been abandoned since the night of the fire. As they descended into the lower levels, the air grew thick with the smell of ancient herbs and the metallic tang of the syndicate's work. Aria felt the presence of her father in the stones, a haunting weight that guided her toward the heart of the darkness. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. The laboratory at the center of the citadel was a tomb of glass and iron, the shelves lined with the skeletal remains of her father's ambition. Aria found the vial of the antidote sitting on a central pedestal, a glowing, iridescent liquid that looked like bottled starlight. Just as her hand closed around the glass, Silas lunged for her, his eyes flashing with the realization that the cure was his only leverage for a pardon. The betrayal was as predictable as the tide, a final act of a man who couldn't help but be a snake. Aria didn't panic. She simply twisted, the glass vial tucked safely against her chest as she drove her heel into Silas's knee. The struggle was a frantic, desperate scramble in the dark, the sounds of their breathing the only music in the tomb. Aria felt a sudden, sharp pain in her shoulder as Silas's blade found a gap in her tunic. But she didn't let go of the cure. She realized in that moment that her father's legacy wasn't the poison, but the strength she used to fight it. She wasn't an Omega, and she wasn't a Luna. She was Aria. And she was the only thing standing between the silver moon and the abyss. With a final, guttural scream of defiance, she shoved Silas into a rack of volatile chemicals, the ensuing explosion providing the distraction she needed to escape. She emerged from the citadel into a world that felt cold and indifferent to her suffering. The moon was setting, and the first light of dawn was a cruel reminder of the deadline she was racing against. Because her wound was deep, every step was a battle against the encroaching darkness in her own mind. She could feel Kael's life force fading, a thin thread of connection that grew more frayed with every heartbeat. She began to run, her feet stumbling over the frozen earth, her lungs burning with the effort of her flight. She was a broken girl in a ruined world, carrying a miracle in a glass jar. When she reached the manor, she found the great hall empty and silent, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and death. She dragged herself toward the Alpha's private chamber, her vision blurring as she pushed through the heavy doors. Kael lay on the bed, his chest no longer moving, his skin the color of marble. Aria collapsed beside him, her trembling hands fumbling with the stopper of the vial. She poured the liquid into his mouth, whispering a prayer to a goddess she hadn't spoken to in years. For a long, terrifying minute, nothing happened. The silence was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud that threatened to bury her alive. Aria closed her eyes, her head resting on Kael's cold chest, and for the first time in her life, she gave up. Chapter 19. The Silver Awakening. The silence in the Alpha's chamber was not the peaceful rest of sleep, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. Aria pressed her forehead against Kael's unmoving chest, her tears carving tracks through the grime and dried blood on her cheeks. The iridescent antidote had disappeared down his throat minutes ago, yet the gray pallor of his skin remained unchanged. Because she had pinned every shred of her soul to this single hope, the lack of a reaction felt like being pushed off a cliff into an infinite void. She clutched his hand, her fingers tracing the familiar calluses of a warrior, and felt the last tether of her sanity begin to fray. Her grief was not a quiet thing. It was a tectonic shift, a violent upheaval of every barrier she had ever built to stay safe. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the marrow of her bones, a frequency so high it made the crystal decanters across the room shatter into fine dust. She didn't realize she was screaming until the sound tore her throat raw, a primal howl that echoed the ancient pain of her lost lineage. As her heart reached a breaking point, the dormant power in her blood, the silver fire her father had tried to manufacture but she had naturally inherited, surged outward in a blinding flash of white light. The room vanished in a whirlwind of energy that felt like the birth of a star. Transformation was usually a symphony of agony, but for Aria, it felt like coming home to a body she had never truly inhabited. Her skin didn't just shift. It dissolved into a shimmering radiance as her human form was consumed by the awakening of a great wolf. She grew in size and stature, her fur emerging not as coarse hair, but as fine metallic silver threads that caught the dim morning light. Because she had spent years being small and invisible, the sudden expansion of her physical presence was a revelation of pure, unadulterated power. She stood over Kael's bed, a creature of myth and legend, her eyes glowing with the fierce, lunar intensity of a true silver guardian. A sudden, sharp intake of breath from the bed made the silver wolf freeze, her ears twitching toward the sound. Kael's chest lurched, his lungs frantically drawing in the air they had almost forgotten how to process. The blackened veins in his neck receded as the antidote, catalyzed by the sudden surge of Aria's silver aura, finally began to purge the serpent's toxin. He coughed, a violent, wet sound that signaled the return of his life force, and his golden eyes flickered open to see the goddess standing over him. Aria let out a soft, rumbling chuff of relief, her muzzle gently brushing against his forehead, before she turned toward the door. The Alpha was alive, but the battle for their home was far from over. Chapter 20. Rallied by the light, Aria burst through the heavy oak doors of the master suite, her silver paws striking the stone floors with the rhythmic thunder of a coming storm. She didn't head for the back stairs or the shadows. She charged directly into the heart of the occupied manor, a streak of living moonlight that demanded to be seen. The serpent-marked guards in the hallway froze in terror, their weapons dropping from nerveless fingers as they witnessed a creature they thought only existed in children's tales. She didn't kill them out of malice. She moved through them like a scythe through wheat, her sheer presence enough to break their resolve and send them fleeing for the exits. Moving toward the great hall, she found a group of loyalists huddled in the kitchen alcove, their spirits broken and their hope extinguished. When they saw the silver wolf, a collective gasp swept through the group, followed by a sudden, fierce ignition of purpose. They didn't see the Omega servant anymore. They saw the physical manifestation of the pack's ancient strength. Because she was a creature of instinct now, Aria didn't need words to lead. She simply tilted her head back and let out a clarion howl that resonated through the very stones of the foundation. It was a call to arms that bypassed logic, reaching into the primal heart of every wolf who still held loyalty to the silver moon. The loyalists emerged from their hiding spots, their eyes reflecting the silver glow of their new leader as they followed her into the fray. They moved as a single unit, a pack reborn from the ashes of betrayal, with Aria at the apex of the spear. Every corridor they reclaimed added to their numbers, as those who had been wavering found the courage to turn on their captors. The manor became a theater of high-stakes retribution, the air filled with the sounds of shifting bone and the triumphant snarls of those who had been suppressed for too long. Aria led them with a tactical brilliance that shouldn't have been possible for a beast, using her knowledge of the estate's layout to trap the invaders in the narrow bottlenecks of the lower floors. By the time they reached the main courtyard, the silver wolf was trailing a wake of radiant energy that seemed to cauterize the wounds of the fallen. She saw the northern Alpha and her retinue pinned down near the gatehouse, their shields splintering under the weight of the Syndicate's final assault. Without hesitation, Aria launched herself over the defensive line, a blur of silver fur and ivory teeth that struck the center of the enemy formation like a meteor. The impact was cataclysmic, sending bodies flying in every direction and creating a pocket of safety for the beleaguered allies. The tide of the war hadn't just turned, it had been redirected by a force of nature. Chapter 21. The Storming of the Gate. The morning sun finally crested the horizon, its golden light clashing with the silver radiance of Aria's form as she stood at the center of the courtyard. The serpent-marked warriors were retreating toward the main gate, their movements frantic and disorganized as they realized their leader was nowhere to be found. Aria didn't let them escape. She moved to block the exit, her silver fur bristling with a static charge that made the air smell of ozone. She was the gatekeeper now, the final arbiter of who stayed and who left the Silver Moon territory. The high-stakes conflict had moved past the point of diplomacy. It was a reckoning that required a total purge of the rot. Silas emerged from the smoke of the burning stables, his human form tattered and his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered rat. He held a torch in one hand and a keg of black powder in the other, a final, spiteful plan to take the manor with him into the abyss. He looked at the silver wolf, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred twisting his features into a gargoyle's grin. He screamed that if he couldn't rule the Silver Moon, then no one would, and he reached for the fuse with a shaking hand. Aria didn't growl. She simply narrowed her glowing eyes, her muscles coiling like a spring as she prepared for the final push. Because the explosion would kill everyone in the courtyard, Aria had to act with a precision that left no room for error. She didn't lunge for the man. She lunged for the keg, her massive silver jaws snapping the iron hoops before Silas could strike the spark. The black powder spilled harmlessly onto the wet cobblestones, rendered inert by the dampness of the morning dew. Silas stared at his empty hands, the realization of his total failure finally breaking the last of his sanity. He slumped to his knees, a pathetic figure amidst the ruin he had created, as the loyalists closed in to take him into custody. The silver wolf stood over the defeated traitor, her breath a rhythmic mist in the cool morning air. She felt the heavy, comforting presence of Kael behind her, the Alpha standing tall despite his bandaged side, his golden eyes fixed on his mate with a reverence that bordered on worship. The pack gathered in a circle around them, a ragged but resilient community that had survived the dark night of the soul. Aria felt the silver fire in her blood begin to recede, the exhaustion of the transformation finally catching up to her. She looked at Kael, a silent understanding passing between them as she began the slow, painful process of returning to her human form. As the silver fur retracted and her human skin reappeared, Aria felt the weight of her new reality. She wasn't the girl who hid in the library, and she wasn't the servant who cleaned the floors. She was the savior of the Silver Moon, a woman who had faced the darkness of her father's legacy and emerged with a light of her own. The war was won, but as she looked at the scarred faces of her pack, she knew that the work of building a new world was only just beginning. She took Kael's hand, her fingers interlocking with his, and together they watched the sun rise over a territory that finally, truly belonged to them both. Chapter 22. The Altar of Ash. The morning mist clung to the jagged remains of the courtyard, swirling around the ankles of the survivors like the ghosts of those they had buried. Aria stood on the elevated stone dais where her father had once been judged, her hand firmly entwined with Kael's. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint, lingering ozone of her silver transformation. Because the authority of the pack had been shattered and reforged in a single night, the atmosphere was thick with a reverent, heavy silence. Hundreds of wolves stood before them, their eyes no longer searching for a servant to ignore, but looking toward a leader who had bled the same red blood on these very stones. Kael stepped forward, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the manor. He didn't speak of conquest or power. He spoke of the truth that had been hidden in the shadows for 5 years. He held aloft the serpent ring, the physical manifestation of the Syndicate's rot, and crushed it within his palm until the metal groaned and snapped. The crowd let out a collective breath, a release of half a decade of tension that had nearly strangled the silver moon. Aria watched the fragments fall into the dirt, realizing that her father's shadow was finally receding, leaving behind a clear path for the woman she had chosen to become. The ceremony of the Luna's mantle was usually a lavish affair, but today it was conducted with the raw simplicity of a battlefield promotion. The Northern Alpha stepped forward, her expression of clinical disdain replaced by a sharp, calculating respect as she draped the ceremonial white wolfskin over Aria's shoulders. The weight was significant, a physical reminder of the lives now resting in her hands. Aria felt the warmth of the fur against her neck, a stark contrast to the threadbare tunics she had worn while scrubbing these floors. Why did it take a war for them to see her? The thought flickered briefly, but it was swallowed by the overwhelming surge of the mate bond, now fully realized and pulsing like a second heart. Kael turned to her, his golden eyes burning with a pride so intense it made her breath hitch. He knelt before her in front of the entire pack, a gesture of submission that no alpha in the history of their lineage had ever performed for a mate. He called her the Silver Luna, the shield of their people and the light in their darkness. Aria reached down, her fingers brushing the scarred skin of his cheek, and urged him to rise. They weren't master and servant, nor king and queen. They were two halves of a singular soul that had finally found its center. Because she had found her voice, she addressed the pack, her words simple and direct, promising a future where strength was measured by loyalty rather than rank. Chapter 23. The Serpent's End. The final interrogation of the captured traitors took place in the very library where Aria had once hidden amongst the dust. Silas sat bound in silver-lined chains, his face a hollowed-out ruin of the man who had once mocked her in the woods. He looked at the high-backed chairs where Kael and Aria sat, his eyes darting toward the hidden compartment she had used to store her secrets. He realized then that he hadn't been defeated by an alpha's strength, but by the patient, invisible observation of a girl he hadn't deemed worthy of a glance. It was a poetic justice that tasted like iron and honey on Aria's tongue. Under the influence of the Northern Alpha's truth serum, Silas revealed the final depth of the Syndicate's reach. The Serpent wasn't just a local rebellion. It was a network of high-ranking betas across all 5 territories who sought to replace the fated mate system with a calculated, eugenics-based hierarchy. Her father had been their first experiment, a man whose ambition had been weaponized against his own kind. Aria felt a cold shiver of realization. The war wasn't over. The head of the snake had been severed here, but the body still writhed in the neighboring lands. She looked at Kael, seeing the same grim determination reflected in his gaze. Their peace would be a guarded one, a sanctuary built on the edge of a blade. As the guards led Silas away to face the pack's ultimate judgment, the library felt lighter, the stagnant energy of the past 5 years finally beginning to circulate. Aria walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the rebuilding walls in shades of bruised purple and burning orange. She remembered the girl who used to watch these sunsets from the attic, praying for a way to vanish forever. That girl was gone, consumed by the silver fire, and in her place was a woman who was no longer afraid to be seen. The invisibility that had been her shield had become her greatest power. She knew the secrets of the small, and she would use them to protect the whole. Kael joined her at the window, his arms wrapping around her waist as he pulled her back against the solid heat of his chest. He whispered that the scouts had found the rest of her father's journals in the southern mountains, records that would help them track down the remaining serpent cells. He promised that they would finish what she had started, that the silver moon would be a beacon of reform for every pack from the north to the southern reach. Aria leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes as she felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of his heart. For the first time since the fire, she felt safe, not because she was hidden, but because she was home. Chapter 24, A Choice of Light. The celebratory feast was a boisterous, chaotic affair that spilled out of the great hall and into the gardens. The scent of roasted venison and spiced ale filled the air, a sensory symphony of a pack rediscovering its joy. Aria sat at the head of the table, her hand resting on Kael's thigh beneath the heavy linen cloth. She watched the younger Omegas moving through the crowd, their heads held a little higher today, their eyes no longer darting toward the exits in fear. She had insisted that the hierarchy be flattened, that every wolf who fought for their home be given a seat at the table. It was a radical shift, a move that the older council members grumbled about, but none dared to challenge the Silver Luna. As the moon rose to its zenith, Kael led her out to the balcony overlooking the vast, pine-covered valley. The silver light of the goddess bathed the world in a quiet, ethereal glow, the same light that lived within Aria's veins. He asked her if she regretted any of it, the years of hiding, the pain of the bond, the burden of her father's legacy. Aria looked out over the territory, seeing the flickering lights of the patrol torches and the steady glow of the village fires. She realized that every moment of suffering had been a forge, tempering her into the weapon the silver moon needed to survive. She shook her head, a soft smile touching her lips as she looked up at her mate. "I spent 5 years hiding from fate," she whispered, her voice a gentle melody in the night air. "But fate was the only thing that saw me clearly when I was invisible." Kael leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of promise and the wild, untamed future ahead of them. The mate bond flared between them, a radiant connection that illuminated the darkness of the balcony and sent a ripple of warmth through the entire estate. They were the architects of a new era, a duo of shadow and light that would ensure the serpent never crawled back into their garden. The girl who survived by hiding had become the woman who led by being seen. Aria took a deep breath, the cool mountain air filling her lungs with the scent of freedom and the intoxicating musk of her alpha. The journey from the kitchen floor to the throne of the silver moon was complete, but the story of the Silver Luna was only just beginning. As the wolves below began to howl in a rhythmic, haunting salute to their new leaders, Aria felt the silver fire in her blood hum in response. She was no longer a ghost. She was the heartbeat of the pack, and she would never let them fade into the dark again.